Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. Continuing my study on practical accuracy, today I want to introduce the time element into the equation. So I've set up a course with a total of 12 of my little steel targets. 8 of them are at close enough ranges that I should be able to hit them easily with an unmagnified red dot. Specifically, I've got 4 at 25 yards and 4 at 40 yards. And then I've got 4 more targets out at 100 yards, which is sufficiently far away for a target of that size that, based on my previous tests, I would expect a magnified optic to provide a significant advantage. So I'm going to try shooting these targets with a red dot, with a regular scope, and then also with a scout scope, a forward-mounted optic. My prediction is that with an unmagnified red dot, I should be able to shoot the targets at close range quite quickly, but then it'll take me longer to hit the targets at long range, whereas with a scope, it's going to be just the opposite. It'll take me longer to transition between targets and therefore longer to shoot the targets at close range, but then when I get out to the targets at long range, I'll be able to shoot them proportionately faster. Now, what I'm curious to test as well is whether the scout scope provides somewhat of a compromise between the two. If it allows me to transition a little bit quicker between targets than a regular scope, then it might give me a better overall time for the course than either the regular scope or the red dot. So, without further ado, let's do some shooting. I started with the regular scope. Next, I used an unmagnified red dot. Here, I realized that without magnification, even the targets at 40 yards took considerably more concentration to hit than to initially acquire. As such, the short-range targets were not really testing what I was after, namely target transition or acquisition speed. Thus, I moved the 40-yard targets up to about 15 yards to remedy the problem. When I got to the 100-yard targets, I could barely see them and couldn't seem to hit them at all with the unmagnified red dot. Thus, after a long string of misses, I decided it wasn't worth wasting any more precious ammunition, and I wrapped up this portion of the test. With the scout scope, everything went pretty well until I got to the very last target. It only took me 4 shots to knock over the first 3 100-yard targets, but then maybe I started rushing or something because I just couldn't seem to hit the last one. Eventually I did knock it down, but I feel like the length of this test may have been artificially extended by shooter error at the end there. Well, this test came out a little bit less conclusive than I would have hoped, but I think there are still some conclusions that we can draw from it. For one thing, using both the regular scope and the scout scope, I was able to knock down all 4 targets at 100 yards. Whereas with the unmagnified red dot, I was not able to knock any of them down before I ran out of ammunition. So I think we can say pretty decisively that a magnified scope offers a significant advantage over an unmagnified red dot for long-range precision shooting. And that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. Similarly, I think we can confidently say that an unmagnified red dot does offer a speed advantage over a magnified scope for close-range shooting that doesn't require as much precision. Specifically in this case, it took me 14.6 seconds to clear the stage of close-range targets using the red dot, compared to 18.7 with the scout scope and 28.8 with the regular scope. I think we can also tentatively conclude that a scout scope offers faster target acquisition than a regular scope, because for the short-range targets, I was able to knock them all down in 18.7 seconds with the scout scope versus 28.8 with the regular scope. Now, it's not a perfectly representative comparison because the targets were closer for the scout scope than for the regular scope. However, with the regular scope, I didn't feel like I was spending much time on aiming versus on target acquisition. You know, I feel like most of the time I spent on the close-range targets with the scope was in transitions, and once I had the target in my sights, you know, getting the hit was not what was taking my time. And so I think it's still a fairly representative comparison, but certainly it would be better if we could run the stage again with the targets at the same distances. So too, with the scout scope, I felt like I really fumbled the last target. So if we look at the time for just the first 3 long-range targets, I had 28.9 seconds to get the first 3 of them down with the regular scope, versus 24.5 to get the first 3 down with the scout scope. So again, there was a speed advantage for the scout scope, even on the long-range targets, if we throw out the last one. Now, because I fumbled that last target, my overall time was considerably longer with the scout scope than the regular scope. So from that, I might also tentatively conclude that for long-range precision shooting, a regular scope is easier to use than a scout scope, even though the scout scope offers faster target acquisition. So, like I said, the test was not as conclusive as I would have hoped. But the cost and availability of ammunition being what it is right now, this was all I could do for the moment. So hopefully I'll be able to either repeat or extend the test at some point in the future, but until then, thank you for watching the Idahoan Show.